Okay, welcome back everyone for the continuation of the narrative of Mary Jemison. We are now on chapter 7. And I just need to move this over here so I can see. General Sullivan with a large army arrives at Canandaigua. Indian troubles. Determined to stop their march. A skirmish at Canisius Lake. Circumstances attending the execution of an Oneida warrior. Escape of an Indian prisoner. Lieutenant Boyd and another man take prisoners. Cruelty of Boyd's execution. Indians retreat to the woods. Sullivan comes on to the Genesee Flats and destroys the property of the Indians. Returns. Indians return. Mrs. Jemison goes to Gardeau. Her employment there. Attention of an old Negro to her safety. Severe winter. Sufferings of the Indians. Destruction of game. Indians' expedition to the Mohawk. Capture old John O'Bale. Other prisoners taken. So here we go. For 4 or 5 years, we sustained no loss in the war, except in the few who had been killed in distant battles. And our tribe, because of the remoteness of its situation from the enemy, felt secure from an attack. At length, in the fall of 1779, intelligence was received that a large and powerful army of the rebels, under the command of General Sullivan, was making rapid progress toward our settlement, burning and destroying the huts and cornfields, killing the cattle, hogs, and horses, and cutting down the fruit trees belonging to the Indians throughout the country. Our Indians immediately became alarmed and suffered everything but death from fear that they should be taken by surprise and totally destroyed at a single blow. But in order to prevent so great a catastrophe, they sent out a few spies who were to keep themselves at a short distance in front of the invading army in order to watch its operations and give information of its advances and its successes. Sullivan arrived at Canandaigua Lake and had finished the work of destruction there, and it was ascertained that he was about to march to our flats when our Indians resolved to give him a battle on his way and prevent, if possible, the distresses to which they knew we should be subjected if he should succeed in reaching our town. Accordingly, they sent all their women and children into the woods a little west of Little Beard's town in order that we might make a good retreat if it should be necessary, and then, well armed, set out to face the conquering enemy. The place which they fixed upon for their battleground lay somewhere between Honeoye Creek and the head of Canisius Lake. At length, a scouting party from Sullivan's army arrived at the spot selected, when the Indians arose from their ambush with all the fierceness and terror that it was possible for them to exercise, and directly put the party upon a retreat. 2 Oneida Indians were all the prisoners that were taken in that skirmish. One of them was a pilot of General Sullivan and had been very active in the war, rendering to the people of the states essential services. At the commencement of the Revolution, he had a brother older than himself, who resolved to join the British service and endeavored by all the art that he was capable of using to persuade his brother to accompany him. But his arguments proved abortive. This went to the British, and that joined the American army. At this critical juncture they met, one in the capacity of a conqueror and the other in that of a prisoner, and as an Indian seldom forgets a countenance that he has seen, they recognized each other at sight. Envy and revenge glared in the features of the conquering savage as he advanced to his brother, the prisoner, in all the haughtiness of Indian pride, heightened by a sense of power, and addressed him in the following manner. "Brother, you have merited death. The hatchet or the war club shall finish your career. When I begged of you to follow me in the fortunes of war, you were deaf to my cries. You spurned my entreaties. Brother, you have merited death and shall have your deserts. When the rebels raised their hatchets to fight their good master, you sharpened your knife and brightened your rifle and led on our foes to the fields of our fathers. You have merited death and shall die by our hands. When those rebels had drove us from the fields of our fathers to seek out new homes, it was you who could dare to step forth as their pilot and conduct them even to the doors of our wigwams, to butcher our children and put us to death. No crime can be greater, but though you have merited death and shall die upon this spot, my hands shall not be stained in the blood of a brother. Who will strike? Little Beard, who was standing by as soon as the speech was ended, struck the prisoner on the head with his tomahawk and dispatched him at once. Little Beard then informed the other Indian prisoner that as they were at war with the whites only and not with the Indians, they would spare his life and after a while give him his liberty in an honorable manner. The Oneida warrior, however, was jealous of Little Beard's fidelity, and suspecting that he should soon fall by his hands, watched for a favorable opportunity to make his escape, which he soon effected. 2 Indians were leading him, one on each side, when he made a violent effort, threw them upon the ground, and ran for his life toward where the main body of the American army was encamped. The Indians pursued him without success, but in their absence, they fell in with a small detachment of Sullivan's men, with whom they had a short but severe skirmish, in which they killed a number of the enemy, took Captain or Lieutenant William Boyd and 1 private prisoners, and brought them to Little Beard's town, where they were soon after put to death in the most shocking and cruel manner. Little Beard, in this, as in all other scenes of cruelty that had happened at this town, was master of ceremonies and principal actor. Poor Boyd was stripped of his clothing and then tied to a sapling, where the Indians menaced his life by throwing their tomahawks at the tree directly over his head, brandishing their scalping knives around him in the most frightful manner, and accompanying their ceremonies with terrific shouts of joy. Having punished him sufficiently in this way, they made a small opening in his abdomen, took out an intestine, which they tied to the sapling, and then unbound him from the tree and drove him round till he had drawn out the whole of his intestines. He was then beheaded, his head was stuck upon the pole, and his body left on the ground unburied. Thus ended the life of poor William Boyd, who it was said had every appearance of being an active and enterprising officer of the first talents. The other prisoner was, if I remember distinctly, only beheaded and left near Boyd. This tragedy being finished, our Indians again held a short council on the expediency of giving Sullivan battle if he should continue to advance, and finally came to the conclusion that they were not strong enough to drive him nor to prevent his taking possession of their fields, but that if it was possible, they would escape with their own lives, preserve their families, and leave their possessions to be overrun by the invading army. The women and children were then set out on still further towards Buffalo to a large creek that was called by the Indians Catawba, accompanied by a part of the Indians, while the remainder secreted themselves in the woods back of Beardstown to watch the movements of the army. At that time, I had 3 children who went with me on foot, one who rode on horseback and one whom I carried on my back. Our corn was good that year, a part of which we had gathered and secured for our winter. In 1 or 2 days after the skirmish at Canisius Lake, Sullivan and his army arrived at the Genesee River, where they destroyed every article of the food kind that they could lay their hands on. A pan of our corn they burnt and threw the remainder into the river. They burnt our houses, killed what few cattle and horses they could find, destroyed our fruit trees, and left us nothing but the bare soil and timber. But the Indians had eloped and were not to be found. Having crossed and recrossed the river and finished the work of destruction, the army marched off to the east. Our Indians saw them move off, but was suspecting that it was Sullivan's intention to watch our return and then to take us by surprise. Resolved that the main body of our tribe should hunt where we then were, till Sullivan had gone so far that there would be no danger of his returning to molest us. This being agreed to, we hunted continually till the Indians concluded that there could be no risk in our once more taking possession of our lands. Accordingly, we all returned, but what were our feelings when we found that there was not a mouthful of any kind of sustenance left, not even enough to keep a child one day from perishing with hunger. The weather by this time had become cold and stormy, and as we were destitute of houses and food too, I immediately resolved to take my children and look out for myself without delay. With this intention, I took 2 of my little ones onto my back, bade the other 3 to follow, and the same night arrived on the Gardeau Flats, where I have ever since resided. At that time, 2 Negroes who had run away from their masters some time before were the only inhabitants of those flats. They lived in a small cabin and had planted and raised a large field of corn, which they had not yet harvested. As they were in want of help to secure their crop, I hired to them to husk corn till the whole was harvested. I have laughed 1,000 times to myself when I have thought of the good old Negro who hired me, who, fearing that I should get taken or injured by the Indians, stood by me constantly when I was husking, with a loaded gun in his hand, in order to keep off the enemy, and thereby lost as much labor of his own as he received from me, by paying good wages. I, however, was not displeased with his attention, for I knew that I should need all the corn that I could possibly earn, even if I should husk the whole. I husked enough for them to gain for myself, at every 10th string, 100 strings of ears, which were equal to 25 bushels of shelled corn. This seasonable supply made my family comfortable for samp and cakes through the succeeding winter, which is the most severe that I have witnessed since my remembrance. The snow fell about 5 feet deep and remained so for such a long time, and the weather was extremely cold, so much so indeed that almost all the game upon which the Indians depended for subsistence perished, and reduced them almost to a state of starvation through that and 3 or 4 succeeding years. When the snow melted in the spring, deer were found dead upon the ground in vast numbers, and other animals of every description perished from the cold also, and were found dead in multitudes. Many of our people barely escaped with their lives, and some actually died of hunger and freezing. But to return from this digression, having been completely routed at Little Beard's town, deprived of a house and without the means of building one, after I had finished my husking, and having found from the short acquaintance which I had had with the Negroes that they were kind and friendly, I concluded, at their request, to take up my residence with them for a while in their cabin, till I should be able to provide a hut for myself. I lived more comfortable than I expected to go through the winter, and the next season made a shelter for myself. The Negroes continued on my flats 2 or 3 years after this, and then left them for a place that they expected would suit them much better. But as that land became my own in a few years, by virtue of a deed from the chiefs of the 6 nations, I have lived there from that until the present time. My flats were cleared before I saw them, and it was the opinion of the oldest Indians that were at Gineshaw at the time that I first went there, that all of the flats on the Genesee River were improved before any of the Indian tribes ever saw them. I well remember that soon after I went to Little Beard's town, the banks of Fall Brook were washed off, which left a large number of human bones uncovered. The Indians then said that those were not the bones of Indians, because they had never heard of any of their dead being buried there, but that they were the bones of a race of men who, a great many moons before, cleared that land and lived on the flats. The next summer, after Sullivan's campaign, our Indians, highly incensed at the whites for the treatment that they had received and the sufferings which they had consequently endured, determined to obtain some redress by destroying their frontier settlements. Cornplanter, otherwise called John O'Bail, led the Indians, and an officer by the name of Johnston commanded the British in the expedition. The force was large and so strongly bent upon revenge and vengeance that seemingly nothing could avert its march, nor prevent its depredations. After leaving Genesee, they marched directly to some of the headwaters of the Susquehanna River and Schoharie Creek, went down that creek to the Mohawk River, thence up that river to Fort Stanwix, and from thence came home. In their route, they burnt a number of places, destroyed all the cattle and other property that fell in their way, killed a number of white people, and brought home a few prisoners. In that expedition, when they came to Fort Plain on the Mohawk River, Corn Planter and a party of his Indians took old John O'Bail, a white man, and made him a prisoner. Old John O'Bail, in his younger days, had frequently passed through the Indian settlements that lay between the Hudson and Fort Niagara, and in some of his excursions had become enamored with a squaw by whom he had a son that was called Corn Planter. Corn Planter was a chief of considerable eminence, and having been informed of his parentage and of the place of his father's residence, took the old man at this time, in order that he might make an introduction leisurely and become acquainted with a man to whom, though a stranger, he was satisfied that he owed his existence. After he had taken the old man, his father, he led him as a prisoner 10 or 12 miles up the river, and then stepped before him, faced about, and addressed him in the following terms. My name is John O'Bail, commonly called Corn Planter. I am your son. You are my father. You are now my prisoner and subject to the customs of Indian warfare. But you shall not be harmed. You need not fear. I am a warrior. Many are the scalps with which I have taken. Many prisoners I have tortured to death. I am your son, and I am a warrior. I was anxious to see you and to greet you in friendship. I went to your cabin and took you by force, but your life shall be spared. Indians love their friends and their kindred and treat them with kindness. If now you choose to follow the fortune of your yellow son and to live with our people, I will cherish your old age with plenty of venison, and you shall live easy. But if it is your choice to return to your fields and live with your white children, I will send a party of my trusty young men to conduct you back in safety. I respect you, my father. You have been friendly to Indians, and they are your friends. Old John chose to return. Corn Planter, as good as his word, ordered an escort to attend him home, which they did with the greatest of care. Among the prisoners that were brought to Genesee was William Newkirk, a man by the name of Price, and 2 Negroes. Price lived a while with Little Beard and afterwards with Jack Berry, an Indian. When he left Jack Berry, he went to Niagara, where he now resides. Newkirk was brought to Beardstown and lived with Little Beard at Fort Niagara for about a year, and then enlisted under Butler and went with him on an expedition to the Monongahela. Now we're up to chapter 8. Life of Ebenezer Allen Otori. He comes to Gardow. His intimacy with a Nanticoke squaw. She gives him a cap. Her husband's jealousy. Cruelty to his wife. Katu's mandate. Allen supports her. Her husband is received into favor. Allen labors. Purchases goods. Stops the Indian War. His troubles with the Indians. Marries a squaw. Is taken and carried to Quebec. Acquitted. Goes to Philadelphia. Returns to Genesee with a store of goods. Goes to farming. Moves to Allen's Creek. Builds mills at Rochester. Drowns a Dutchman. Marries a white wife. Kills an old man. Gets a concubine. Moves to Mount Morris. Marries a 3rd wife and gets another concubine. Receives a tract of land. Sends his children to other states. Disposes of his land. Moves to Grand River where he dies. His cruelties. Sometime near the close of the Revolutionary War, a white man by the name of Ebenezer Allen left his people in the state of Pennsylvania on the account of some disaffection toward his countrymen, and then came to the Genesee River to reside with the Indians. He tarried at Genesha a few days and came up to Gardow, where I then resided. He was apparently without any business that would support him, but he soon became acquainted with my son Thomas, with whom he hunted for a very long time, and made his home with him at my house as winter came on, and then he continued his stay. When Allen came to my house, I had a white man living on my land, who had a Nanticoke squaw for his wife, with whom he had lived very peaceably, for he was a moderate man commonly, and she was a kind, gentle, cunning creature. So it so happened that he had no hay for his cattle, so that in the winter he was obliged to drive them every day, perhaps half a mile from his house, to let them feed on the rushes, which in those days were so numerous as to nearly cover the ground. Allen, having frequently seen the squaw in the fall, took the opportunity when her husband was absent with his cows daily to make her a visit, and in return for his kindnesses, she made and gave him a red cap, finished and decorated in the highest Indian style. The husband had for some considerable length of time felt a degree of jealousy that Allen was trespassing upon him with the consent of his squaw. But when he saw Allen dressed in so fine an Indian cap and found that his dear Nanticoke had presented it to him, his doubts all left him, and he became so violently enraged that he caught her by the hair of her head, dragged her on the ground to my house, a distance of about 40 rods, and threw her in at the door. Hiakatu, my husband, exasperated at the sight of so much inhumanity, hastily took down his old tomahawk, which for a while had lain idle, shook it over the cuckold's head, and bade him to go off. This enraged husband, well knowing that he should feel a blow if he waited to hear the order repeated, instantly retreated and went down the river to his cattle. We protected the poor Nanticoke woman and gave her victuals, and Allen sympathized with her in her misfortunes until spring, when her husband came to her, acknowledged his former errors, and that he had abused her without a cause, promised a reformation, and she received him with every mark of a renewal of her affection. They went home lovingly, and soon after they moved to Niagara. The same spring, Allen commenced working my flats and continued to labor there till after the peace in 1783. He then went on to Philadelphia on some business that detained him but a few days, and he returned with a horse and some dry goods, which he carried to a place that is now called Mount Morris, where he built or bought a small house. The British and Indians on the Niagara frontier, dissatisfied with the Treaty of Peace, were determined at all hazards to continue their depredations upon the white settlements which lay between them and Albany. They actually made ready and were about setting out on an expedition to take that effect when Allen, who by this time understood their customs of war, took a belt of wampum, which he had fraudulently procured, and carried it as a token of peace from the Indians to the commander of the nearest American military post. The Indians were soon answered by the American officer that the wampum was cordially accepted, and that a continuance of peace was ardently wished for. The Indians at this were chagrined and disappointed beyond measure, but as they held the wampum to be a sacred thing, they dared not to go against the import of its meaning, and they immediately buried the hatchet, as it is respected by the people of the United States, and they smoked the pipe of peace. They, however, resolved to punish Allen for his officiousness in meddling with their national affairs by presenting the sacred wampum without their knowledge, and went about devising means for his detection. A party was accordingly dispatched from Fort Niagara to apprehend him, with orders to conduct him to that post for trial, or for safekeeping till such time as his fate should be determined upon in a legal manner. The party came on, but before it arrived at Gardow, Allen got news of its approach, and he fled for safety, leaving the horse and goods that he had brought from Philadelphia as an easy prey to his enemies. He had not been long absent when they arrived at Gardow, where they made diligent search for him until they were satisfied that they could not find him. And then they seized the effects which he had left and returned to Niagara. My son Thomas went with them, with Allen's horse, and he carried the goods. Allen, on finding that his enemies had gone, came back to my house, where he lived as before, but of his return they were soon notified at Niagara, and Nettles, who married Priscilla Ramsey, with a small party of Indians came on to take him. He, however, by some means found that they were near, and he gave me his box of money and his trinkets to keep safely till he called for it, and again he took to the woods. Nettles came on determined, at all events, to take him before he went back, and in order to accomplish his design, he, with his Indians, hunted in the daytime and lay by at night at my house, and in that way they practiced for a number of days. Allen watched the motion of his pursuers, and every night after they'd gone to rest, came home, got some food, and then returned to his retreat. It was in the fall, and the weather was cold and rainy, so that he suffered extremely. Some nights he sat in my chamber till nearly daybreak, while his enemies were below, and when the time arrived, I assisted him to escape unnoticed. Nettles at length abandoned the chase, went home, and Allen, all in tatters, came in. By running in the woods, his clothing had become torn into rags, so that he was in such a suffering condition, almost naked. Hiakotu gave him a blanket and a piece of broadcloth for a pair of trousers. Allen made his trousers himself, and then built a raft on which he went down the river to his own place at Mount Morris. About that time, he married a squaw whose name was Sally. Then the Niagara people, finding that he was at his own house, came and took him by surprise when he least expected them, and carried him to Niagara. Fortunately for him, it so happened that just as they arrived at the fort, a house took fire, and his keepers all left him to save the building, if possible. Allen had supposed his doom to be nearly sealed, but finding himself at liberty, he took to his heels, left his escort to put out the fire, and ran to Tonawanda. There, an Indian gave him some refreshment and a good gun, with which he hastened on to Little Beard's town, where he found his squaw. Not daring to risk himself at that place for fear of being given up, he made her but a short visit and came immediately to Gardow. Just as he got to the top of the hill above the Gardow Flats, he discovered a party of British soldiers and Indians in pursuit of him, and in fact they were so near that he was satisfied that they saw him, and concluded that it would be impossible for him to escape. The love of liberty, however, added to his natural swiftness, and gave him sufficient strength to make his escape to his former castle of safety. His pursuers came immediately to my house, where they expected to have found him secreted and under my protection. They told me where they had seen him but just a few moments before, and that they were confident that it was within my power to put him into their hands. As I was perfectly clear of having had any hand in his escape, I told them plainly that I had not seen him since he was taken to Niagara, and that I could give them no information at all respecting him. Still unsatisfied and doubting my veracity, they advised my Indian brother to use his influence to draw from me the secret of his concealment, which they had an idea that I considered of great importance, not only to him, but to myself. I persisted in my ignorance of his situation, and finally they left me. Although I had not seen Allen, I knew his place of security, and was well aware that if I told them the place where he had formerly hid himself, they would have no difficulty in making him a prisoner. He came to my house in the night and awoke me with the greatest caution, fearing that some of his enemies might be watching to take him at a time when, and in a place where, it would be impossible for him to make his escape. I got up and assured him that he was safe, but that his enemies would return early in the morning and search him out if it should at all be possible. Having given him some victuals, which he received thankfully, I told him to go, but to return the next night to a certain corner of the fence near my house, where he would find a quantity of meal that I would have well prepared and deposited there for his use. Early the next morning, Nettles and his company came in while I was pounding the meal for Allen, and insisted upon my giving him up. I again told them I did not know where he was, and that I could not, neither would I, tell them anything about him. I well knew that Allen considered his life in my hands, and although it was my intention not to lie, I was fully determined to keep his situation a profound secret. They continued their labor and examined, as they supposed, every crevice, gully, tree, and hollow log in the neighboring woods, and at last concluded that he had left the country and gave him up for lost, and then they went home. At that time, Allen lay in a secret place in the Gulf a short distance above my flats, in a hole that he had accidentally found in the rock near the river. At night, he came and got the meal at the corner of the fence, as I had directed him, and afterwards lived in that gulf for 2 weeks. Each night he came to the pasture and milked one of my cows, without any other vessel in which to receive the milk than his hat, out of which he drank. I supplied him with his meal, but fearing to build a fire, he was obliged to eat it raw and wash it down with the milk. Nettles having left our neighborhood, and Allen, considering himself safe, left his little cave and came home. I gave him his box of money and trinkets, and he went to his own house at Mount Morris. It was generally considered by the Indians of our tribe that Allen was an innocent man, and that the Niagara people were persecuting him without a just cause. Littlebeard, then about to go to the eastward on public business, charged his Indians not to meddle with Allen, but to let him live among them peaceably, and to enjoy himself with his family and his property if he could. Having the protection of the chief, he felt himself safe, and he let his situation be known to the whites, from whom he suspected no harm. They, however, were more inimical than our Indians, and they were easily bribed by Nettles to assist in bringing him to justice. Nettles came on, and the whites, as they had agreed, gave poor Allen up to him. He was bound and carried to Niagara, where he was confined in prison through the winter. In the spring, he was taken to Montreal or Quebec for trial and was honorably acquitted. The crime for which he was tried was for his having carried the wampum to the Americans, and thereby putting too sudden a stop to the war. From the place of his trial, he went directly to Philadelphia and purchased on credit a boatload of goods, which he brought by water to Connaughton, where he then left them and came to Mount Morris for assistance to get them brought on. The Indians readily went with horses and brought them to his house, where he disposed of his dry goods. But not daring to let the Indians begin to drink strong liquor for fear of the quarrels which would naturally follow, he sent his spirits to my place, and we sold them. For his goods he received ginseng roots, principally, and a few skins. Ginseng at that time was a plenty and commanded a very high price. We prepared the whole that he received for the market, expecting that he would carry them to Philadelphia. In that I was disappointed, for when he had disposed of and got pay for all his goods, he took the ginseng and skins to Niagara, and there sold them and came home. Tired of dealing in goods, he planted a large field of corn on or near his own land, attended to it faithfully, and succeeded in raising a large crop, which he harvested, loaded into canoes, and carried down the river to the mouth of Allen's Creek, then called by the Indians Guinesaga, where he unloaded it, built himself a house, and lived with his family. The next season, he planted corn at that place and built a grist and sawmill on the Genesee Falls, now called Rochester. At the time Allen built the mills, he had an old German living with him by the name of Andrews, whom he sent in a canoe down the river with his mill irons. Allen went down at the same time, but before they got to the mills, Allen threw the old man overboard and drowned him, as it was then generally believed, for he was never seen or heard again afterward. In the course of the season in which Allen built his mills, he became acquainted with the daughter of a white man who was moving to Niagara. She was handsome, and Allen soon got into her good graces, so that he married and took her home to be a joint partner with Sally, the squaw, whom she had never heard of until she got home and found her in full possession. But it was too late for her to retrace the hasty steps she had taken, for her father had left her in the care of a tender husband and gone on. She, however, found that she enjoyed at least an equal half of her husband's affections, and she made herself content. Her father's name I have forgotten, but her name was Lucy. Allen was not contented with his 2 wives, for in a short time after he had married Lucy, he came up to my house, where he found a young woman who had an old husband with her. They had been on a very long journey and called at my place to recruit and rest themselves. She filled Alan's eye, and he accordingly fixed upon a plan to get her into his possession. He praised his situation, enumerated his advantages, and finally persuaded them to go home and tarry with him a few days at least, and partake of a part of his comforts. They accepted his generous invitation and went home with him, but they had been there but 2 or 3 days when Alan took the old gentleman out to view his flats, and as they were deliberately walking on the bank of the river, he pushed him into the water. The old man, almost strangled, succeeded in getting out, but his fall and exertions had so powerful an effect upon his system that he died in about 2 or 3 days and left his young widow to the protection of his murderer. She lived with him about 1 year in a state of concubinage, and then she left him. How long Alan lived at Allen's Creek, I am unable to state. But soon after the young widow left him, he removed to his old place at Mount Morris and built a house where he made Sally his squaw, by whom he had 2 daughters, a slave to Lucy, by whom he had 1 son. Still, however, he considered Sally to be his wife. After Alan came to Mount Morris at that time, he married a girl by the name of Marilla Gregory, whose father at the time lived on Genesee Flats. The ceremony being over, he took her home to live in common with his other wives, but his house was too small for his big family. For Sally and Lucy, conceiving that their lawful privileges would be abridged if they received a partner, united their strength and whipped poor old Marilla so cruelly that he was obliged to keep her in a small Indian house a short distance from his own, or to lose her entirely. Marilla, before she left Mount Morris, had 4 children. One of Marilla's sisters lived with Alan about a year after Marilla was married, and then she quit him. A short time after they all got to living at Mount Morris, Alan prevailed upon the chiefs to give to his Indian children a tract of land 4 miles square, where he then resided. The chiefs gave him the land, but he so artfully contrived the conveyance that he could apply it to his own use, and by alienating his right, destroy the claim of his children. Having secured the land in that way to himself, he sent his 2 Indian girls to Trenton, New Jersey, and his white son to Philadelphia for the purpose of giving each of them a respectable English education. While his children were at school, he went to Philadelphia and sold his right to the land, which he had begged of the Indians for his children, to Robert Morris. After that, he sent for his daughters to come home, which they did. Having disposed of the whole of his property on the Genesee River, he took his 2 white wives and their children, together with his effects, and removed to a Delaware town on the River de Trench in Upper Canada. When he left Mount Morris, Sally, his squaw, insisted upon going with him, and actually followed him, crying bitterly and praying for his protection some 2 or 3 miles, till he absolutely bade her to leave him, or he would punish her with severity. At length, finding her case hopeless, she did return to the Indians. At the great treaty at Big Tree, one of Alan's daughters claimed the land which he had sold to Morris. The claim was examined and decided against her in favor of Ogden, Trumbull, Rogers, and others, who were the creditors of Robert Morris. Alan yet believed that his daughter had an indisputable right to the land in question, and got me to go with Mother Farley, a half-Indian woman, to assist him by interceding with Morris for it, and to urge the propriety of her claim. We went to Thomas Morris, and having stated to him our business, he told us plainly that he had no land to give away, and that as the title was good, he never would allow Alan nor his heirs 1 foot or words to that effect. We returned to Alan the answer that we had received, and he, conceiving all further attempts to be useless, went home. He died at the Delaware town on the River de Trench in the year 1814 or 15, and left 2 white widows and 1 squaw, with a number of children to lament his loss. By his last will, he gave all his property to his last wife, Marilla, and her children, without providing in the least for the support of Lucy or any of the other members of his family. Lucy, soon after his death, went with her children down the Ohio River to receive assistance from her friends. In the Revolutionary War, Allen was a Tory, and by that means became acquainted with our Indians when they were in the neighborhood of his native place, desolating the settlements on the Susquehanna. In those predatory battles, he joined them, and, as I have often heard the Indians say, for cruelty was not exceeded by any of his Indian comrades. At one time, when he was scouting with the Indians in the Susquehanna country, he entered a house very early in the morning, where he found a man, his wife, and one child in bed. The man, as he entered the door, instantly sprang on the floor for the purpose of defending himself and his little family. But Allen dispatched him at one blow. He then cut off his head and threw it bleeding onto the bed with the terrified woman, took the little infant from its mother's breast, and holding it by its legs, dashed its head against the jamb, and left the unhappy widow and mother to mourn alone over her murdered family. It has been said by some that after he had killed the child, he opened the fire and buried it under the coals and embers. But of that I'm not certain. I have often heard him speak of that transaction with a great degree of sorrow, and as the foulest crime he had ever committed, one for which I have no doubt he repented. And that is the end of chapter 8. So the next time we'll come back for chapter 9.
Okay.
So that was quite a interesting couple of chapters. Anybody have any thoughts today? Not very crazy about Allen.
Definitely not.
I'm surprised Jemison would, protect him and be on his side. He seemed like such a scoundrel.
I know. I don't understand that either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Scoundrels, putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very
Well,
much.
the Indians
Bad
thought he
news.
was not, that he was, an innocent and kind of a good guy. No way. Holy
No,
cow.
he sounds just like a very terrible person.
Yes, he
Yeah.
does.
Whether he repented or not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, exactly. There's some things you may repent, but that doesn't mean you're forgiven for it.
Yeah.
Sounds
Well, that
weird.
last story, the last little bit was really just unimaginable. I wonder
Yeah.
what became of the woman.
I don't
Like,
know.
is she able to move on from that and have a normal life, or?
Who knows? Seeing
Yeah.
your husband and your child killed right in front of your eyes? I don't know.
You.
Yeah, that's horrendous. That's horrendous.
Yeah, he just sounds like a very cruel person, and he doesn't sound like he really cared about anyone, judging by the different women
Just
he.
himself.
The
Yeah.
women, the children taking their land, that,
Yeah,
these Indian children. That's just
yeah,
unbelievable.
Scoundrel.
yep. Well, anyway, with that, we'll see what happens tomorrow.
Thank
What
you.
other unsavory characters will we get to meet?
Right.
Well,
Thank you.
Okay.
thanks.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye. This way it's better.